When I was on a recent flight back to New York, the plane went through some very severe turbulence. It was really scary. I'm scared of heights just in general, but I also don't trust planes. The way that the wing flaps around, it feels like it's gonna rip off the damn thing. And during this turbulence, the woman beside me started to have a seizure. She tensed up, her hands slammed down onto the table, water went everywhere. It was really scary. I was kind of freaking out. And all I could think in that moment was, oh my god, I think I'm about to... Death is anything but certain. Nobody knows how they're gonna die, when they're gonna die, or what happens after they die. It always comes down to faith or guesswork. And that uncertainty allows the topic to really be approached by an endless set of angles, although at first glance, it might not seem like we take full advantage of all those angles in our storytelling. When you think about how death is often depicted, in media specifically, your immediate thought is that it's probably either glossed over, with Action Man number 312 mowing down his 900th unnamed enemy soldier of the first act, or if you're gonna focus on it, it's gonna be depicted as something incredibly tragic. The architecture that we assign to death is often shown to be ominous and fractal, never quite maintaining its shape long enough to really understand what you're looking at. It is darkness and it's fear, it's the sound of terror and grief syncopating, echoing in a hollow room with no windows or doors. It slithers its way into your every pore. You can't escape it, you can't beat it. It slowly envelops you until you can't breathe. But some depictions of death take a much different approach. One that's maybe a bit more hopeful about what awaits us on the other end, or has strong emphasis on the positive impact that a life can have on those left behind. So it's a little strange that with this being such a big question mark, maybe the biggest question mark, it's really hard to think of death in any way besides that overpowering, invariable feeling. So what I want to do in this video is talk about different games that handle different elements around or different responses to death, with them often featuring the sadness and melancholy that feels unavoidable when discussing this kind of topic, but not always making those emotions the focal point of the experience. This obviously isn't like a comprehensive list on every game that's about death, but it's just a few games that I thought were worth discussing in this context. Now, I am going to be talking about a lot of games that are kind of on the shorter end and sometimes hard to discuss without bringing up a couple elements of them that may not be very apparent at first glance. So if you're somebody who's just really sensitive to spoilers, here's a quick list of games that are going to show up in this video. I'm also going to leave timestamps so you can skip through any one of these if you want, and also all mentions of their narrative elements will be kept very vague. Also, if you saw a game on that list that you don't want to be spoiled, don't worry, me talking about the fact that they are about death is not an inherent spoiler. In some cases, you know, somebody doesn't even necessarily have to die. Sometimes it's more about the fear that we have about dying, or in the case of the first game I want to talk about, what does it mean to truly live? But first, I need to talk about game preservation. The constantly changing tech landscape, as well as the multiple contingencies that most games have to operate in their original form, means that games preservation is harder than basically preserving any other form of media. Recently on my second channel, I talked about the Ninja Gaiden 2 remake, which actually had to be made from scratch because the devs had a really hard time accessing the original source code. And even in this video, I talk about Limbo, which came out in 2010, not that long ago, and is 2 years older than Spec Ops: The Line, a game that was recently delisted from stores and is no longer available for purchase. Preserving and celebrating games is a real uphill battle, and it's obviously one that I'm really invested in because I can't sit here and talk about games about death if we witness the death of games. Which is why I'm beyond excited to partner with Lost in Cult, a design studio that's dedicated to preserving and showcasing video games, their development, their history, their art, and a ton more in the most incredible ways. They collaborate closely with game creators to produce high-quality products like this upcoming novel about the history of Dead Space. I mean, look at this thing, it's gorgeous. As well as putting out a lot of projects around smaller games like this kind of art book interview mashup for games like Eastward, Citizen Sleeper, Sable, and The Outer Wilds, which I know a lot of you guys would be super interested in. They're also putting out books covering games history, this beautiful looking book covering some of Jacob Geller's work, who I also know a lot of you are fond of, and even vinyl collections of games like South of Midnight and El Paso Elsewhere. Their current backer campaign, which ends February 28th, is in collaboration collaboration with Crystal Dynamics for Legacy of Kain, the dark fantasy series that recently launched a couple of remasters. The campaign includes the Book of Nosgoth, a detailed encyclopedia about the Legacy of Kain series and its lore, and Scourge of the Seraphan, which is a fully fleshed out tabletop RPG, and you're able to purchase these either individually or together. If you back the campaign over on BackerKit through the URL in the description, and remember it ends February 28th, you get access to an exclusive pre-order edition, which packages the deluxe editions of both items with a suede cover, textured base tray, and gold foil embroidering. Tell me this doesn't look incredible. Again, you can back the campaign over at the URL in the first line of the description or the pinned comment. It actually got fully funded in under an hour, and it's now just hitting its stretch goals, so if you contribute to it, you just make the product better. And you can use the second link in the description as well as my code ASADLIC to get 5% off site-wide on Lost in Cult. That's ASADLIC. Thank you so much to Lost in Cult for sponsoring this video and for helping preserve games in new and interesting ways. They say when you're about to die, your life flashes before your eyes. It's an idea that actually may have a level of scientific merit, although obviously nothing conclusive has been determined just yet, but it's perpetuated a lot in art since it's really poetic to imagine that we're able to take one last look at the things we love before we pass. It's sometimes depicted as this final warning or eye-opening moment for those lucky enough to escape the grip of death, that maybe they need to start making some changes in their lives, but it can just as easily be very comforting, imagining that our final moments aren't filled with pain, but with love, especially if our lives were joyful, exciting, and lived to the fullest. Before Your Eyes is a story about those final moments of reflection, as it explores our central character's life through a series of fleeting moments that fast forward at random intervals every time you blink. You as in you, by the way, the person playing the game. As long as you're playing with some kind of webcam or in VR, the game will actually track when you blink in real life and automatically move on to the next scene. It's genius. But Before Your Eyes is a lot more than just a party trick. It takes what I said a little bit earlier about this whole life flashing phenomenon being more comforting if the deceased person lived their life to the fullest, and it kind of puts that under a microscope. In particular, it questions what living life to the fullest even means. Did we live life to the fullest if we didn't pursue our dreams, didn't travel the world and try every possible new experience that came our way? If we spent most of our days in a cubicle or in our own home saying next year is going to be the year I truly do something great, or if we do attain what we always wanted but it still somehow felt empty. The game doesn't address all of these doubts directly, but through the unique experiences of the character, it's easy to see the central theme of not feeling like you're good enough, and how that can be a seemingly impossible feeling to overcome. It may even cause us to repress certain memories so that we don't have to directly confront the fact that who we are and who we want to be are two completely different people. Before Your Eyes calls into question what we view as a successful life, and what makes our lives worth cherishing and celebrating. It's a game for anybody who's ever felt like they haven't quite achieved what they're supposed to achieve, and maybe don't recognize the importance of what they have around them because it falls under the shadow cast by what they should have. I think that's a much more common feeling than a lot of people like to admit, and for me, it really made me reflect on my own self-worth and goals. For a second, it actually made me sit there and cut myself a little bit of slack for once. It's just so easy and convenient to define ourselves through money, achievements, job titles, and degrees, and not through the family that we have, the friends we've given advice to, and our actual unique qualities as people. To be kind of vulnerable here, and if we're gonna get depressing in any of these videos, this is probably the right one to pick. It kind of made me reassess this question that I've asked myself a lot throughout the years, which is, if I died right now, would I have done anything great? Because I always feel like I'm on my way to something great eventually if I figure everything out, but I'm not there yet, and I don't know if I'll be there soon. And then I look at my age and think, man, I'm just getting older and older and still haven't hit the level of success that I want. I remember distinctly this one time I was listening to When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go by Billie Eilish, and I was like 19 at the time, a couple years out of high school, and I learned that Billie Eilish was younger than me and was already like maybe the biggest pop star of the generation, and instead of being impressed by her, it just hurt me because I thought that I was a failure at 19 years old and would never amount to anything. And I've always realized the flaws in that way of thinking, but it's really hard to sit there and reevaluate these feelings when it seems like every single day you're seeing people online doing just a little or a lot more than you are. And I'm not ashamed to admit that it kind of took sitting down and playing something like this that was so creative and touching and adamant in its messaging for me to realize that maybe there wasn't a point in me wanting more if I wasn't even fully appreciative of what I had right now. Sometimes it takes a strong story about death for you to realize you need to change the way you live, and while it's not easy, I'm sure it's not going to be like a magical turning point where everyone who plays this game will have some epiphany that'll last them a lifetime. I'd be lucky if mine lasts until Tuesday. The hope is that at the very least, if I feel buried under this pressure of wanting to do great things, the memory of this game can bring me a little bit of comfort. Despite being a really sad narrative, it's ultimately a beautiful experience about not fearing death, although that's usually easier said than done. There's an endless list of theories around what happens to us after death. Do we go to heaven or hell? Maybe we're reincarnated into something completely new. Maybe our souls wander gray fields until we start forgetting who we even were in life, or we simply lose consciousness and become consumed by this inky black Why did I do this video? I'm having an existential crisis. But maybe the most terrifying concept associated with death is the idea of limbo. This precipice between life and death, time and space, an uncertain state where you aren't aware of the rules or whether you're moving at all closer to an exit of some kind, perhaps cursed to relive the same moments over and over, but never gaining the mercy of becoming unaware. Everything keeps going, but nothing moves forward. Playdead's Limbo is an exploration of this very idea, albeit a very short one that can only briefly capture such a horrifying concept. It is an incredibly influential game that kind of started this renaissance of the modern puzzle platformer genre, and it's also a game where nothing feels sacred or respected. Even in the early minutes, you see mutilation, tragedy befalling children, and the desecration of the dead, but none of those things compared to Big Spider! Oh my god! Whose idea was it to put the big spider? Limbo never really explains itself and what you're doing, which has led to quite a few equally plausible theories on what the story actually is. None of which I'm gonna delve into here because obviously spoilers, but its adherence to maintaining this unknown exterior is key to properly representing this twisted, unknown world. It's a game that doesn't give you any button prompts or tutorials. Figure it out. There's no rule book to navigating limbo. Who do you think is gonna help you here? And one of the things I find most interesting about this game is just how many of its puzzles require a certain level of dexterity and existing knowledge that all but guarantee you need to die at least a few times throughout your playthrough. Unless you've seen these puzzles before and remember what to do, I'd be shocked if a couple of Limbo's tricks didn't wind up getting you killed, which gives the impression that you need to die in horrible ways to learn anything in this world. And even though the game doesn't actually ever show this in its systems, I've always thought that in-universe what's probably happening is that when you die, the character has to go all the way back to the beginning to get to the point where your checkpoint was, which makes all of these puzzles and death traps kind of like your version of Sisyphus's boulder. The whole concept of Limbo is this near endless repetition taking place at the edge of time, so it really doesn't make sense for it to be super lenient in its punishments. But of course, as an actual game experience, especially considering how tricky some of these puzzles can get, I understand why it just has a simple checkpointing system, because restarting on death would have been a bad option. Theories aside, the only thing that seems certain about Limbo after closer inspection is that its challenges and enemies are reflections of common fears that a child might have, indicating that the only way to actually break through the threshold into the afterlife is if you face what held you back in your worldly life, which almost gives it a positive message that's in line with Before Your Eyes, learning to overcome and accept the negative things in your life when reflecting on them after death, except this one doesn't show it through an exploration of memory, it does it by torturing a small child for a few hours. Another broad similarity between the two is that they're both about what happens to us after we die, but something that's maybe more terrifying is being alive, but being acutely aware that you're on a slow, painful march towards death, which is where we get a game like mouthwashing. Mouthwashing is an even more surreal piece of fiction than Limbo is, despite not actually being about the afterlife itself, at least not overtly. It's about a shipping crew that gets into a terrible accident that leaves them stranded, eventually without food and water, with little hope of being extracted. Just like all of these games, it's just as much about life as it is about death, with it serving as a representation of what happens when we don't take accountability for our actions, how we justify our wrongdoings, and how a break from a typical societal structure can make us devolve into these hollowed shells of our former selves, or beasts driven only by our primal instincts and selfish desires. The game kind of plays out like this psychedelic representation of how it feels to slowly go insane waiting for death to take you. It's a really great game, but it's also an off-putting one, which is why I kind of want to move on from it and talk about this game about a cute little grandma. Psych, idiot! The grandma game is depressing. The game follows an old lady who tends to her small farm alone after all her relatives have moved to the big city nearby, with her only form of contact being these letters that they send back. Letters that start off kinda normal, but quickly start indicating that things may not be going as smoothly as your family had hoped. All the while, you continue to tend the farm, slowly, repetitively, monotonously. You sometimes briefly interact with a postman, but for the most part, it's an incredibly lonely experience, especially in light of all these messages from people you once had in your life. The premise of Stillness of the Wind isn't directly about death itself, but it does target a lot of the same feelings and atmosphere that come with losing loved ones seemingly permanently, with you being forced to just witness the suffering without being able to do much about it. That Dragon Cancer is another example of that creative choice, as it acts almost as a playable diary of the parents of a small child named Joel who was diagnosed with cancer. The story being told here is an autobiographical one, and it occasionally features real sound bites that came from the treatment and care process, which makes it just an intensely personal game. There's a lot of dichotomy in how it presents the process of trying to come to grips with the situation, with vivid depictions of both hope and hopelessness. One parent bracing for the worst, or perhaps accepting that they can't brace for it and will simply drown, and the other maintaining a steadfast belief that everything is going to be okay, outlining the stark difference in how we all personally grieve. Religion is also a very core aspect of this experience, with both parents being devout Christians and filtering both their own thoughts and the creative vision of this game through that belief system. It's an element of the game that obviously will resonate differently with different people, and there are actually a few things on even the production level of the game that didn't always resonate with me. Like if I put on my critic hat for a little bit, which is, it's difficult to do for a game like this, but the writing would sometimes go back and forth between simplistic and then waxing poetic a little bit, and I never quite felt like it hit the right balance. And also the vocal work, which was obviously done by people who aren't voice actors, does sound like it's done by people who aren't voice actors, but the whole point is that it's real, it's authentic. The voices you're hearing are the voices of the people who are actually in distress. So whether you play through this game and strongly empathize with every part of it, or maybe you don't understand how some of the characters cope with things or their reliance on faith, it's impossible not to feel a strong human connection through it. When I brought up Before Your Eyes earlier, I mentioned how we often define the impact of a life off of what it accomplished, and sometimes overlook the more intimate, interpersonal impact of a life. And I think that Dragon Cancer is a really good example of why that's a flawed way of thinking. It began development when Joel was 4 years old, and at that point he had been facing this ailment for 3 years already. Joel hadn't even had the chance to understand what his future could be when that future was threatened. But to his parents, he was everything. To people fighting the same afflictions, he was a hero. And now, for the rest of time, he is immortalized in this work as a symbol of love, strength, and family. It's definitely the most emotional game that I played through for this video. You really have to be in the right frame of mind for it, because it has a lot of positive messages, but it also makes you wonder how you even move on when you go through something like this. It's difficult to make an entire narrative around the concept of letting go, because in order to get there, you kind of need to cover a lot of steps first. Acceptance is the final stage of grief, so it doesn't have as much impact if you don't also spend a significant amount of time on the stages prior, which is why even this video kind of follows that basic structure of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And a game that manages to cover those stages beautifully without any dialogue is Grease. In Greece, you push your way through 5 distinct sections of different colors inspired by the 5 stages of grief, exploring these emotional states purely through gameplay techniques and evocative visual design. In sharp contrast to the other puzzle platformer on this list, Limbo, it's actually, as far as I understand, impossible to die or fail in this game. The biggest setback you're probably going to have is maybe missing a jump and having to hop back up a few platforms. And this makes a huge difference in how these two games feel. The choices in Limbo make you feel claustrophobic, targeted, and heavily punished for any wrong move, which really shows how painful of a process death and acceptance can be, while Greece is a canvas that feels far less restrictive, giving you the freedom and space to quickly recover from mistakes, showing the difference it makes to have an open and welcoming environment when trying to accept loss. It also manages to express the importance of factors like resilience and companionship, without which you're completely unable to move past certain sections. It's a really great game that I think anyone can pick up and enjoy, and I think it went down as my favorite from this bunch. But if there's one game that I think does a perfect job at isolating this idea of acceptance specifically, I think for my money it has to be Spiritfarer. This is a somewhat lengthy boat building simulation game, which is usually not my vibe, and I will admit that I haven't finished it after starting it last month, but I've been really pleasantly surprised with not only how fun it's been to engage with its navigation and building systems, but also how well written it is. The game has you play as Stella, a girl who's taken over the role of the Spiritfarer from Charon, the ferryman who would lead the souls of the dead to the underworld in ancient Greek myths. Now, you've been given the duty to lead all these souls to their final destinations, and in practice that means recruiting spirits to be companions on your ship, learning more about them and what holds them back from peace, and eventually helping them find that solace, accept the finality of their life, and ascend to a higher plane. Each spirit you interact with has unique qualities and different mental and spiritual afflictions, and they're not only all genuinely interesting to talk to, but they feel real, and that's because, they are. Kind of. When the development team at Thunder Lotus had this idea to explore what it would be like if we weren't so scared of death, it gave the team members an opportunity to not only have open and safe conversations about their experiences with death, but also to weave those stories directly into the art that they were making. Features, designs, and personalities for characters would often be modeled after the real-life people that had inspired them, which makes the game both a love letter to those who passed on, and also a means for the members of the dev team to come to terms with some of that loss themselves. Its unique blend of transparency and its emotional elements, combined with this simple yet fantastical notion that death is not a scary or sad concept, results in a story that can very effectively isolate the final stage of grief in a way that I've never quite seen before. It was kind of a nice comfort game to play in between all these other super intense or emotionally draining games on this list. Not that this game can't be sad, it's also surprisingly happy considering its subject matter, which is really something I wasn't expecting to see much of in this slate of games. I think the massive differences we see in each of these games that do cover broadly the same topic is a real testament to not only how monstrous of a topic it is, but also how we as individuals and groups can really perceive and express our feelings about these fundamental concepts of life in entirely different ways. Playing through all of these different artistic expressions of death that ranged from just complete fear of what the beyond held to why death was almost a beautiful thing was a real roller coaster of a journey. It gave me a lot to think about personally, and in some cases it made me feel a strong connection to people that I had never even met before, which I think is really beautiful. And I hope that in compiling all these games that I somehow gave you something to think about, or if not, I at least gave you a big list of games that you can go play now. I'd love to know what you guys thought about these games in the comments. Please be careful of spoilers, give fair warning if you're going to talk in depth about any of the games on this list. If you want a bit of a lighter video, I should have something up on my second channel about now. It's either about Indiana Jones or Ninja Gaiden or both. I have no idea. Something will be up there. Make sure to subscribe, join the Discord, and I'll see you all next time.